Elections officer shall calculate the total number of valid votes of the electors which have been cast for each list of candidate, and thereupon shall ascertain the results of the elections in accordance with section 97 and 98. So again, the request from the chairman of the Ghana Elections Commission to the CEO, it's a request that he has to submit his report based on what is stated here in the Constitution, based on a calculation based on the total number of valid votes of the electors. So it's that report that is going to be submitted by the CEO, Mr. Keith Lowenfield. So it is not a case that the chairperson of the Ghana Elections Commission can instruct, but rather the CEO of the Election Commission has to submit his report based on valid votes as stated in the Constitution, section 96.
And because rightfully so, it is the Chief Elections Officer who is the custodian of the information, of the data that is compiled. He's the administrator of the elections process, and that is why she requests from him this information. But again, the section of the press statement that Chris would have read talked about compiling the report, composing the report as a result of section 96 and also the section 60 of the 2020 recount order. The recount order in itself says that the commission shall, after deliberating on the report at paragraph 11, determine whether it should request the chief elections officer to use the data compiled in accordance with paragraph 11 as a basis for the submission of a report under section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act.
That's correct. That's correct. So that is what is going to be had as of tomorrow, based on the CEO's submission to the chairperson of the Ghana Elections Commission. I just want to take you quickly back to yesterday and the unfolding days, and of course then you saw a whole flurry of pronouncement from several media outlets which didn't lend to the current tensions in the country. Yesterday, the Ghana Elections Commission met and they deliberated on the report which was submitted by the CEO, Mr. Keith Lowenfield. Remember, we keep pointing out to you that this is a 4-stage exercise. The first stage was the tabulation of the votes having been counted at the Architron Conference Center. The second stage was the CEO, Mr. Keith Lowenfield, submitting his report based on the tabulation and the validation of those numbers that were counted. The third stage is what transpired between yesterday and the day before, and that was the Guyana Elections Commission, the chairperson and the commissioners sat and met and deliberated on the report which was submitted by the CEO on Saturday. The fourth and final stage is that the CEO now submits his report to the chairman of the Ghana Elections Commission, of which he will use that to make a declaration. That is the fourth and final stage, as we pointed out from you, that the national recount and the verification of the votes that were cast is a 4-stage exercise. Yesterday, we have only witnessed the third stage. And again, at that meeting yesterday, the Ghana Elections Commission nor the chairman of the commission made no declaration of any winner. I repeat, no declaration was made yesterday by GCOM nor the chairman of the Ghana Elections Commission, which is the only person that can make a declaration or pronounce on elections result. So yesterday at that meeting, there was no such pronouncement. There wasn't even an indication, not even in the statement emanating from GCOM. But you saw media outlets, based on their own interpretation, which is always not the wisest thing to do, put information out there. And of course, it created a whole use of tension across the country. The Ghana Elections Commission did not, or rather the chairperson of the Ghana Elections Commission did not make a declaration yesterday as it relates to the results of the elections.
And as a matter of fact, Chris, the Elections Commission has said repeatedly that it is the only entity who has the authority to declare
That's
and
correct.
to state who exactly has emerged from the March 2nd, 2020 elections as its victor.
That's right. That's correct. That's correct. And if you have the time and you go to the Guyana Elections Commission's page, you will have an opportunity to see the press release that was issued yesterday. And if I can just quickly go through the first part, after considerable deliberation at the commission on the report submitted by the Chief Elections Officer, Mr. Keith Lowenfield, on the national recount of votes cast in the March 2nd, 2020 general and regional election, Chairperson of the Commission, Justice Claudette Singh, has requested for the CEO a report to ascertain the results of the elections under Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act, Chapter 103, and in keeping with the Order Number 60 of 2020 and its addendum dated the 29th of May 2020. And when you go to the Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act, and of course this is what it states, and I quote, and this is Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act. The Chief Election Officer shall calculate the total number of valid votes of the electors which have been cast for each list of candidates, and thereupon shall ascertain the results of the elections in accordance with Section 97 and 98. So that is what is prescribed. So the chairman of the Guyana Elections Commission has requested the CEO, Mr. Keith Lowenfield, to prepare and submit his report. And of course, and she states here, it's in keeping with Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act. And the Representation of the People Act, as I just read out there, states that the Chief Elections Officer shall calculate the total amount, the total number of valid votes of the electors.
Yep. And Chris, I know that a day in politics rather is like a year.
Oh, boy.
And this press statement was issued by GCOM on June 6th rather. It seems like 5 years ago or 6 years ago. But the thrust of the press statement was GCOM is the only constitutional authority to pronounce on the elections result.
That's
of which it reads this very short statement. It says, the Guyana Elections Commission has taken note of reporting sections of the media and by individuals on social media platforms announcing the results of March 2nd general and regional elections. While the national recount of ballot cast in those elections is almost to an end, the Commission wishes to remind that the Guyana Elections Commission is the only constitutional authority mandated to pronounce on the results of the election. In this regard, the Commission is urging political parties, organizations, interest groups, and other individuals to desist from pronouncing publicly on the results of the elections. Now, this was a press statement coming out of GCOM on June 6th.
Right, and even I can go further to quote Section 177, oh boy, Constitution of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. This is under the title the President, and it states here that a presidential candidate shall be deemed to be elected as president and shall so be declared by the chairman of the Guyana Elections Commission, acting only in accordance with advice of the Chief Elections Officer after such advice has been tendered to the Elections Commission at a duly summoned meeting. Right? So let me just sort of rewind and bring all of this back and
Wheel and come again.
Wheel and come again and put it into perspective. So this is a 4-stage exercise in terms of the national recount. The first stage was in which you saw the party representative were at the Artichoke Conference Center where the votes were tabulated. Anomalies, discrepancies, observations were made. That was the first stage. The second stage is the Chief Elections Officer, Mr. Keith Lowenfield, submits his report based on the findings coming out from the recount exercise that was had. That report was submitted to the Guyana Elections Commission on Saturday. The third stage was what was had yesterday and the day before. The third stage is in which the commissioners and the chairman of the Guyana Elections Commission deliberates on the report that was submitted by the Chief Elections Officer, Mr. Keith Lowenfield. That has ended. The fourth and final stage, the chairman of the Ghana Elections Commission has requested from the Chief Elections Officer to submit his report in keeping or submit his report of the elections under Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act.
Correct.
Right? So
Correct.
that request has been made. Now, based on the Constitution and Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act, it states here, and I quote, "The Chief Elections Officer shall calculate the total number of valid votes of electors which have been cast for each list of candidates, and thereupon shall ascertain the results of the elections in accordance with Section 97 and 98. Okay? Right. So when he makes this submission, then this is what happens. That the presidential candidate shall be deemed to be elected as president and shall be so declared by the chairman of the Elections Commission, acting only in accordance with advice of the Chief Elections Officer. After such advice has been tendered to the Elections Commission at a duly summoned meeting."
I always tell my law students that the law is about language and logic.
Correct.
And it's easy to get carried away by emotions and so many other things. But every word that is written in the law has a specific meaning. It might gain its meaning in and of itself. It might gain its meaning based on the words that precede it and the words that follow it. And so the law is about language and logic, and one has to really spend some time organizing your thoughts and putting yourself even in the mind of the framers of the Constitution. What did Parliament intend when they said X or Y or Z? But I think in a layman's terms, unless the Chief Elections Officer has prepared that final report and submitted to the chairperson of GCOM, the election remains inconclusive.
That's correct.
And that is the final stage that we were at which Chris spoke. And I would argue that is why His Excellency has been again consistent that he will abide by whatever declaration is made by the chairman of the Ghana Elections Commission. And lots of us want to be premature and to run ahead, as the press statement coming out of GCOM has cautioned us that they are the constitutional authority to pronounce on the election result.
Exactly. Now, just yesterday afternoon, we got a reaction from co-campaign manager of the APNU-AFC, Mr. Joseph Harmon, who went through the paces and just essentially provided that sort of information. So we want to bring that to you quickly, and then of course we come back and we go back through all of these, which to some is very confusing. But please remain calm, focus.
Hold a focus.
And of course, we will continue to bring you the information. Here now is Mr. Joseph Harmon, the co-campaign manager of the APNU-AFC.
Commission this afternoon made a decision based on two proposals that was submitted to it this morning. There is some quarters a feeling that there is a declaration or a decision by the Commission. Just a quick comment on that.
All right, just quickly let me say that based on the statement I heard made by the chairman of the Elections Commission, that she is going to write the CEO of the Elections Commission, giving him specific directions with respect to what she would like to see in what is called a Section 96 report. A Section 96 report requires that the CEO and only the CEO submits a report to the chairman for her declaration on the valid votes that have been cast at the elections. So what I am still to see is what is going to be contained in this letter to the CEO. The point that is to be made is that we had a process of a recount, which lasted for over 33 days. And that persons were out there working every single day for 33 days. And therefore, if we were to say that that work is not to be considered, even though the gazetted order requires it to be so, then certainly we will have to see what the letter says. But in my view, the CEO cannot declare anything other than valid votes. And in his determination of what are valid votes, we would need to see those reports of the chief elections officer reflected in the way those votes are tallied. So I believe that the chairman gave a very convoluted decision this afternoon, which still has to be interpreted, and I believe she herself recognized that and has actually said, I will give you, the CEO, further instructions in writing. So we have to see what instructions they are. But what I can say to you is that no elections in Guyana can be determined on votes that are not valid. And this was the whole purpose of the recount, to determine what were the valid votes that were cast at the elections. And the purpose of the recount was to so determined. And so I think that we are still to await the letter which is sent to the CEO and the CEO's response. So as far as I'm concerned, there is no winner or loser that has been declared as yet. The chairman has made a finding so far on the report which was submitted by the chief elections officer. And the final determination will be made when she puts in writing what is our meaning to the chief elections officer. He interprets it and then he responds in a way that the Guyanese people can understand. At this point in time, I think that the instructions from the chairman is very convoluted. And so it has left a lot of persons uncertain as to really what has been her ruling. And I think that we are still to await the clarification of that ruling, when in fact she sends her letter to the chief elections officer and he makes clear what is the decision. The chief elections officer always has to act in accordance with the constitution and the laws of this country, and therefore cannot make a declaration or make a submission which is unlawful. So he has to be aware of that, and certainly has to send to the chairman of the Elections Commission for a declaration what are considered of being the valid votes that were cast at these elections. I thank you.
Right, welcome back. That was, of course, the co-campaign manager of the APNU-AFC, Mr. Joseph Harmon, giving his reaction just yesterday afternoon, immediately after the conclusion of the Ghana Elections Commission meeting. Of course, overnight, that letter has been sent to the Chief Elections Officer. However, we don't have a copy of that letter to read for you the content. We note on social media there is a purports to be the letter from the chairperson, but of course we cannot validate, so therefore we cannot read here the content of that letter. But we are of the belief that the letter has been sent to the Chief Elections Officer. And of course, the letter will be in keeping with the statement that was issued by the Ghana Elections Commission just yesterday afternoon, immediately after the meeting that was had there. You note that Mr. Joseph Harmon did mention that it was convoluted in terms of what direction specifically was being guided. But after that interview with Mr. Harmon, the press release emanated from the Ghana Elections Commission, and of course, subsequent that letter would have been sent to the Chief Elections Officer. So to read back again quickly from the press release that was issued by the Ghana Elections Commission just yesterday, it states here, after considerable deliberation at the Commission on the report which was submitted by the Chief Elections Officer, Mr. Keith Lowenfield, on the national recount of votes cast in the March 2nd, 2020 general and regional election, Chairperson of the Commission, Justice Claudette Singh, has requested for the CEO to prepare a report ascertaining the results of the elections under Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act, Chapter 103, and in keeping with the Order Number 60 of 2020 and its addendum dated the 29th of May 2020. And as we read for you, what is Section 96? A lot of people would ask, what is Section 96 of the Representation of the People Act? What does it mean? What does it interpret? So let me just quickly read for you what is the Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act. And it states here, the Chief Election Officer shall calculate the total number of valid votes of electors which have been cast for each list of candidates, and thereupon shall ascertain the results of the election in accordance with Section 97 and 98. So that is clear. Chairman Lowenfield has to prepare his report based on the number of valid votes that were cast. And of course, that report has to be sent to the chairman of the Elections Commission. Now, when this is done, this is the other section of the law which states that a presidential candidate shall be deemed to be elected as president and shall be so declared by the chairman of the Elections Commission, acting only in accordance with the advice of the Chief Elections Officer after such advice has been tendered to the Elections Commission at a duly summoned meeting. Now, I just want to quickly give you some background as it relates to how is it that the law states that the chairman of the Ghana Elections Commission can only act on advice from the Chief Elections Officer. You recall in 1997 elections, when you had the incident in which the then chairman of the Elections Commission, Mr. Do Not Sing, while votes were still being counted, some 40-something thousand votes were still being counted, he ran off and he swore in Janet Jagan as president. After that incident, the law was amended to put what is called a safety net in place, or a safety mechanism. So that safety mechanism that has been put in place is that the chairman of the Elections Commission cannot on his or her own declare somebody the winner of the election. It has to be based on advice, and stated here, language used only on advice from the Chief Elections Officer. So
and then there are other things which follow that too, Chris.
Exactly.
Because they go on to talk about a duly constituted meeting of the commissioners.
That's right.
And part of what happened in 97 is that the Mrs. Jagan was declared president in one room by the chairman of the Ghana Elections Commission, Mr. Do Not Sing. Mr. Do Not Sing was the chairman, and who subsequently went on to become the Attorney General in the PPP's administration 2 years later. But while other members of the commission, other commissioners were meeting in a separate room, unknown to them, he went ahead and declared Mrs. Jagan as president, while the votes were still being counted, and they were not consulted on the process. So again, hence why we have this safety feature, that it must be the advice of the Chief Elections Officer, that it must be tendered at a duly constituted meeting of the commission. And so you have stages even in that process to follow.
And I mean, I know the question will be asked, okay, what is valid votes? Okay, so valid votes are essentially those votes haven't been ascertained by the person who was duly eligible to cast a vote based on the list of electors, which would refer you back to the OLE, the official list of electors. You recall that over these 40-something days, we have been stressing to you that when they open those ballot boxes, there are certain documentation that is being looked for. Now, these, and I think it was Ganesh Maipal who had advised us that it was a two-pronged approach, either Ganesh Maipal or Mr. Chanel Daniels, that essentially you had the GCOM staffers who were part of the workstation, and they were looking for what they dubbed critical documents, if I'm correct. And those critical documents that they were looking for are those PEs. Remember, they refer to PE
Correct,
4,
correct.
PE 7, PE
Correct.
11, and so forth, which are critical documents for the Guyana Elections Commission to ascertain the votes or the ballots inside of the box. So some of those critical documents would have been the OLE, the official list of electors that would have been used by a presiding officer.
Correct.
So he or she would have been able to tick off 1 to 100 and 100 persons voted, and these are the name of the person voted. So you have that, which will bring validity to inside of the box if you have 100 votes. So if you have 100 ballots inside of the box, then the OLE should have 100 names that are ticked off.
Correct.
Then if by chance, let's say 3 persons voted by way of certificate of employment, which would be used by GCOM staffers who are in a different location, then you would see the votes inside of the box being not 100, but 103. So now to bring validity or to validate those 3 votes, you would now have to find those certificates of employment. Okay, 1, 2, 3, we found these 3 certificates of employment. So now we have 103 valid votes. Then it might have been one of those stations in which you had intermixing. So then you might have found an additional 32 votes. And the only way now you could bring validity or credibility to those 33 other votes is that you would have to go through the list and see that this polling station was an intermixing station, and the total amount of discipline services votes that were sent to that polling station was 32. So then therefore you were able to, so at the end of that exercise, once those critical documentations are there, that is how you bring valid, or that's how you could then credit the votes as being valid. So 100 eligible electors, and then you find the OLE, which was used by the presiding officer, and you have 100 ticks. So that 100 vote is now valid. Then you have an additional 3 votes, and you don't know where those votes came from. When you look inside of the box, you find 3 certificates of employment. These are GCOM staffers who voted. Okay, great. So you have these 3. So now these 3 votes now become valid. So you're now at 103. But then you have an additional 32 votes that you don't know where these votes come from. So now you have to bring validity or legitimacy to that 32 votes. You check your documentation, and then you see, oh, this polling station was an intermixing polling station. It had 32 ballots from the discipline services that was sent. So now you're able to validate those additional 33 votes. So that is the reference that we make, and it's stated in the Constitution as it relates to total valid votes. The votes can only be valid based on the supporting documentation to ascertain the legitimacy of the votes that were cast and found inside of the boxes.
Correct.
So when the CEO submitted his report, I think last Saturday, you did note that he outlined, if you read through that document, that there was only about 60% of the votes that GCOM was able to bring credibility to or validate those votes. And of course, in that, there's also a breakdown. So that is the term, and that is how the term is arrived. Valid votes, it is based on those documentation that brings credibility to those votes. In the cases, for example, 47 boxes on the east coast of Demerara with no supporting documentation. So there's no way you could validate those votes, because all you have essentially is ballot boxes with votes inside or ballots inside, but none of these critical documents that GCOM would look for, poll book, OLE, certificate of employment, oaths of identity, and the list goes on. None of those documentation was found. So there's no way that GCOM could validate those votes as being credible.
Correct, Chris, on all counts. And that is the process where we are. And again, with the GCOM press statement in mind about them being the only constitutional authority to make declarations or statements on the election results, and with the fact that, again, the chairwoman has not made a declaration as yet,
That's right.
we are still very much in the national recount process, based on the fact that we are at stage 4, where the declaration is yet to be made.
That's correct. That's correct. Just last evening, we had an interview with Mr. Aubrey Norton, getting his perspective on the recount and the meeting that was had there at GCOM. here is that piece with Mr. Aubrey Norton, and then we'll come back and we'll just go back through this for the benefit of those of you who are just joining us. Stay tuned. A pleasant good evening. Welcome back to the APNU AFC TV as we continue to bring you the information as it relates to that meeting that was had this afternoon with the Ghana Elections Commission. We did show you earlier sentiments and views expressed by the three commissioners, Mr. Vincent Alexander, Mr. Desmond Trotman, and Mr. Charles Corbin. Out of that meeting, the Ghana Elections Commission chairperson, Justice Claudette Singh, has instructed the Chief Elections Officer, Mr. Keith Lowenfield, to submit his report. Again, there has been no declaration by the Ghana Elections Commission nor the chairperson, Justice Claudette Singh, as it relates to the outcome of the election. Again, there has been no declaration by the Ghana Elections Commission nor the chairperson, Justice Claudette Singh. To continue to bring you the information and guidance based on the meeting that was had this afternoon, we have our guest this evening, Mr. Aubrey Norton, who is going to sort of take us through the paces in terms of the outcome of that meeting today with the Ghana Elections Commission, and the air conditioner is on.
Okay, good evening to all the listeners, and thanks for having me, Chris. I believe the first thing people need to recognize is that throughout this process, and I'm defining the process first as the election and then the post-election activities, the People's Progressive Party has become famous for trickery. They have become famous for putting out their own positions. And today, they apparently put out in a press statement, congratulations to Irfan Ali. They put out that the Elections Commission chairman would have declared that they won. Now, in my opinion, that is garbage. The reality is that you've had the discussions. As far as I know, the tabulation matrix was sent, the observations were made, and as far as I know, the Elections Commission chairman has accepted that the observation is part of the process.
Yeah.
And I went through all the documents sent out by GCOM, and I saw no document that seeks to or even appears to substantiate what the PPP is saying. So what I would say to our supporters at this time is that the chairman of the election commission has sent a letter to Mr. Lowenfield asking him to prepare his report.
Yeah.
What will come in that report is for us to see. But I do not believe we should follow the People's Progressive Party propaganda and start to run around and talking about anybody being elected. As it stands, there is one president, David Granger. And until a final outcome from GCOM arrives, one cannot be talking about anything as it relates to the election outcome.
Yeah.
We're aware that the international community is placing untold pressure, and they seem not to have an interest in the fact that a lot of illegalities occur.
Yeah.
We have noted that the chairman made it clear that she does not have the ability, or the law doesn't permit her to nullify the elections.
That's right.
All I would say, that is only one option. There are others. I believe our supporters should not be misled by PPP propaganda and allow them to incite them into anything at this stage, because it is very much premature. So, in essence, I'm saying to our supporters, there has been no declaration, none whatsoever, that the PPP won the 2020 elections and that Irfan Ali will be sworn in sometime soon. And we need to bear that in mind and be very clear and not allow the PPP propaganda machinery to create anxiety amongst us.
Correct, correct. All right, so Mr. Norton, so coming out from the meeting today, the chairperson has now written to the chief elections officer. What happens next?
Well, the chief election officer will have a number of options, which I don't want to discuss.
Okay.
But he will have to prepare his report, outline those options, and then indicate to the election commission chairman where the process should go. That is as much I would say on the situation at this stage.
Right. All right. As it relates to the chairperson and the CEO, in terms of the roles based on the Constitution, how does that work?
The law is clear. The chairman asks the CEO, in keeping with the law, to prepare a report. That report is prepared and sent to the chairman, as I understand it. And as I understand it, the only person, according to law, that she can take advice from is the chairman, is the CEO. So we have to await and see what the CEO will say in his report. I believe that cognizance, I should explain this, though the chairman would have said that she cannot pronounce on nullifying an election. I don't think that precludes the Elections Commission from looking at the irregularities and in its pronouncement take them into consideration. They are two different things. And so I believe the irregularities are still on the table. It's a question of how they are be utilized to deal with the situation.
And does it, in terms of when, okay, so the CEO will make his submission. Is it then that there's a vote that is taken at the commission level?
If I read the law clearly, this report goes to the chairman, for the chairman to act on. I don't recall in the law that it has to go back to the commissioners. And so as I see it, she has given that final instruction in keeping with the law. Mr. Lowenfield would prepare what he has to prepare, and then either a declaration or a non-declaration will be made. I'm not so sure where that will go.
Okay. All right. Not to delve too deep in terms of the information that is out there, because you see several media outlets pronounced on essentially saying that GCOM has hinted that the People's Progressive Party Civic Court Irfan Ali is going to be elected. In terms of the responsibility, based on the press release that came out from the Ghana Elections Commission, do you see those?
There is nothing in the press release that suggested that the PPP has won.
Correct.
And Irfan Ali is anything elect. What the press release did is to give a factual account and to indicate that the chairman, by way of letter, will give directives to
The CEO.
the CEO. Some media personnel have arrived at the conclusion that the use of the concept recount means automatically it is the recount tabulated. I don't know that that is true. I will await to see what Keith Lowenfield does, and then we can take it from there.
Excellent, excellent. All right, in final, any remarks in terms of... Welcome back. That was, of course, Mr. Aubrey Norton. We sought to get his reaction after the GCOM meeting that was had just yesterday. Of course, again, you heard Mr. Norton there that essentially now the CEO has to submit his report, and in keeping with those the constitutional mandates as it's prescribed, exactly what has to happen.
Yep, I found it very, very insightful. Again, after the commission would have met yesterday and the chairwoman, Justice Claudia Singh, made her pronouncement, we can all admit we were confused, we were baffled, and we were all seeking clarity. And it's good to hear that kind of clarity being brought to bear by our very own Mr. Aubrey Norton. And one would guess, rightfully so, that the chairwoman who has spent her life in the legal fraternity is very steep in that kind of language, and one has to have several interpretations of what she has said, what she has pronounced on. And while we are now approaching, the final stages, there is more to come.
Exactly.
There's more to come.
All right, so as we're about to go out of program time, let me just quickly recap for you where we are. Yesterday, as we mentioned before, the exercise, the national recount, and the examination of the ballot is a 4-stage exercise. The first of which was had with the exercise that was had at the Artichon Conference Center. The second stage was the CEO submitting his report, and that was done last Saturday. The third stage we saw yesterday and the day before, and that is in which the commissioners and the chairman deliberate on the CEO's report. Now, we move to the fourth and final stage of the national recount and the examination of the ballot boxes, which is the chairperson of the Ghana Elections Commission making a declaration. Now, that declaration is based on the guidance from Article 96 or Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act. So let me just quickly take you through that stages so you'll have a good idea in terms of where we are. Yesterday, at the conclusion of that meeting, the Ghana Elections Commission issued a press release, and the press release stated as follows: after considerable deliberation at the Commission on the report submitted by the Chief Elections Officer, Mr. Keith Lowenfield, on the national recount of votes in the 2nd of March 2020 general and regional elections, Chairperson of the Commission, Justice Claudette Singh, has requested for the CEO to prepare a report to ascertain the results of the elections under Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act, Section or Chapter 103, and in keeping with the Order Number 60 of 2020 and its addendum dated the 29th of May 2020. Now, the People's Representation Act, Section 96, as quoted here in the GCOM statement, says this, and I quote, this is the Representation of the People's Act, Section 96. The Chief Elections Officer shall calculate the total number of valid votes for the electors which have been cast for each list of candidates, and thereupon shall ascertain the results of the elections in accordance with Section 97 and 98. So this is the preparation of the report by the CEO, stated here, total number of valid votes. Then this is what happens: that a presidential candidate shall be deemed to be elected as president and shall so be declared by the chairman of the Elections Commission, acting only in accordance with advice of the Chief Elections Officer after such advice has been tendered to the Elections Commission at a duly summoned meeting. So the request has been made by the chairman of the Ghana Elections Commission of the CEO to submit his report under Section 96 of the Representation of the People's Act. The Representation of the People's Act, Section 96, speaks to total number of valid votes.
Correct.
And that will be part of the report that the CEO has to submit to the Ghana Elections Commission. The chairman of the Elections Commission, only upon advice given by the the Chief Elections Officer, shall make a declaration. That is where we stand, and that essentially is Section 4 of the exercise.
Correct. So, for those many of you who are asking, what do I do with my blow, we would only say, don't hang it up just yet.
That's correct. That's correct. All right, so that's our program time today. On behalf of my colleague, Mr. Sherrod Duncan, our technical team, Mr. Ross, my name is Christopher Jones. We look forward to seeing you right back here at 5 o'clock this afternoon, where we'll continue to bring the information to you. And of course, we'll have some more contributors to guide us through all of this that is happening. Again, the Ghana Elections Commission yesterday made no declaration. The chairman of the Elections Commission yesterday made no declaration as to a winner of the March 2nd general and regional elections. Until this afternoon, have a pleasant rest of your day. Goodbye for now.